Welcome to another sample Craze video tutorial. This one is aimed at the case standard and how to calibrate to the case standard. And this video is exclusive for heavyweightproducer.net. I'd like to thank Klaus, Chris, Gregor, Steve, all the boys at Heavyweight Base for such a wonderful resource site and Facebook group. It's helped all of us immensely. And I love contributing to it and learning from it. So thanks a lot, guys. Okay, let's kick off with this. There are some things that I'm going to try and cover in its entirety within this video. As you can appreciate, I've created videos for each and every function and process. And it's often very hard to try and encapsulate that in a 15-20 minute video. As you can appreciate, to get to this stage, you need to understand a number of concepts which I've covered in all my videos. Primarily to do with summing, phase cancellation, the pan law, monocompatibility, bandpass cleaning, headroom, dynamic range, and so on. All of these go together to form the basis for you to understand how to calibrate to the case standard. So I'm going to assume you have a certain amount of knowledge. If not, I'll explain to you what the case standard is. Before I do that, let me explain what's going on with Cubase here. Cubase is my main DAW, mainly because it has all the utilities I need right in front of me. I used to be with Logic until about 6 or 7, and really I only changed because I switched over to Reaper and then Cubase, Pro Tools, and so on and so on. As a producer, I tend to use a number of different software, but for writing and producing, I stick with Cubase. It has everything I need. And it has some utilities which sadly are lacking in Logic. For example, every channel has a pre-trim or a pre-gain knob on it, which sadly in Logic you don't have. In Logic, I believe you have to insert the gainer plugin to control the gains of that channel if you're not using the fader. We have the same problem when it comes to the pan mode. For example, in Cubase, I can select stereo balance or dual panel mode. Again, in Logic, you have to insert another utility plugin. I think it's called the directional or the bidirectional machine. I'm not sure. Okay, so what is the case standard? Well, the case standard was developed by my friend Bob Katz, thankfully. And believe it or not, it was probably a good 15 years ago. Bob is like me. He's old school. And if you come from the old school analog console way of thinking, we knew the analog consoles had a good 20 dB of headroom depending on the console, so we'd drive into that headroom for harmonic distortion. In the digital domain, we don't have that luxury. We're dealing with binary here. Everything is an absolute, and 0 is our ceiling. What we now need to do is to create that headroom. The simplest way to create a headroom in a mix is to grab your master fader and drag it down. And say to yourself, right, I'm going to leave this here and mix to that. But that doesn't make sense for a number of reasons. Let me explain to you why we set a standard and then we use our trim knobs, which to be honest, every DAW should have anyway, and we calibrate to that standard. I'm sure you've encountered when you move a fader just a tiny little bit, suddenly the audio just jumps right down. We try and avoid things like that by mixing to a standard and using these as fine-tuned knobs. However, the main reason we use the case standard is for headroom and dynamic range. And Bob cleverly designed a bunch of references. One was the broadcasting reference. And I actually suggest you go to his website and download the PDF on the reference, because there's a lot of good information there about metering and so on and so on. And if you really want to know a bit more about this subject, then I recommend that you try and investigate as much as you can. Go and buy the book, The Art and Science of Mastering Audio by Bob Katz. I think it's on revision 3. I'm not sure. Bob was telling me, but I've forgotten. I'm a bit of an idiot like that. Wonderful book, industry standard. Every studio has it. Go and get it. It'll give you acres of wonderful information. Now, let's actually start to work out what these standards are. A case standard simply is a reference for a meter. That's all it is. It's a way for us to read information. However, The problem we have with most DAW designs is they don't design based on the analog strip console. I think Cubase is one of the only ones that does, and the main reason why I use it. Every channel will have a pre and a channel strip. Now, the beauty on the pre here is that not only can I control gains using the pre, here, but I can also do funky little things like flip phases, which I've done in another video where I try and show you how to remove repeated files, which you tend to get when people render projects and send the stems to a producer. You'll often find stereo files are split into left and right monos. I always get rid of those, irrespective of whether they've got effects on them or not, because I'm going to produce it and I don't want repetitive files. The only time I start creating repetitive files of the same thing is if I need a source for a sidechain. A good example is a kick. I'll create a copy of the kick channel, disable one channel and send that to the sidechain compression. End the story. Okay, so case standards. Bob decided that the best way to work was to create 3 reference standards. One was the K12, which was really aimed at the broadcasting industry because those guys like to have stuff loud. So K12 gave 12 dBs of headroom. I don't know why, but broadcasting engineers, or rather the marketing department, said, okay, make it louder. Why? So that your radio station, when you were turning that old days, that little analog knob, and you were trying to tune the radio stations and find the radio station you wanted, the loudest one always grabbed your attention. So broadcasting engineers decided to do everything loud. They're idiots. Okay, K14. That's the standard I tend to use. It gives me 14 dB of headroom below 0. And that means that I've now got 14 dBs to play with. K20, tended to use for wide dynamic range mixes or orchestral stuff. I don't really use K20. However, I do use K14 and pull back a few more dB. So you could in effect say it's K20. What I'm going to do first is disable the control room meter in Cubase, so we're only dealing with what we call the ppm meter in Cubase. This is the standard master bus metering, or rather all the meters that you'll get in most DAWs. They're peak program meters, as opposed to being sample peak or true peak meters. In my estimation, ppm meters are useless. I always disable this and stick to the control room. But because you might not have a control room monitor with all the standards built in, like Cubase has generously given us, with all the K standards, LUFS, plus a ton of settings for the behavior of the meter, because you're not going to get that in, say, Logic or maybe another DAW, I'm going to work and assume that you don't have the control room K functionality. Okay, most EDM producers that I know will work with a master bus that has their own chain of specific effects and dynamics in there. It's basically what we call the signature of the producer. I have different setups that I save as presets for different types of mixes. This one that I'm working on for a friend and a client of mine, which is actually going to be the basis of one of my tutorials on my website, involved the AFX Oral Exciter followed by the TLA Grand channel. However, why I wanted to show you that is because most people ask me, well, hang on, I mix to the bus, which means you're mixing to whatever is on the master bus. Where do I stick my calibration meter? It's always got to be after all the effects. You can obviously look at what's going in here, but ultimately you're only listening to what's coming out. So we want to control the master level that's eventually going to come out of here. Let me disable these effects. In the meantime, actually, before I do that, have a listen to what a difference those sounds make to the overall mix. So we're now back to the dry mix. What is it that we need to set our standards with? The first thing we need to do is to pick a meter, and it'll be a third-party utility plugin that will display the K standards for it, but more importantly, allow us to adjust so we can really tighten and calibrate accurately to that K standard. I've disabled everything now. We're only going to use one plugin on the master bus to calibrate to the K standard, and for that I use the K meter. is made by Meter Plugs, and I've used this in all my books and a lot of my videos. It's a wonderful, wonderful meter. However, there is a restriction or two with it, so I'll show you the workarounds. First of all, we select our standard here from K20 to K12. Don't worry about any of the other settings. The only things we need to worry about are the K standards here and whether we're in peak or RMS mode. I mix in RMS, and the reason I do that is because our ears are not linear. We listen logarithmically, so why not mix logarithmically? RMS, root mean square. That means we're looking at average values. And if I had to throw an absolute at you, and I'm only talking with things like generating a stable cyclic event, like a sine wave, you would find that the difference between RMS and peak mode's 3 dBs. I'll show you that in a second if I load up a generator here. I'll put in the MDA test tone, which is a free utility, and I've slapped it. Let me bring the volume down yet again, because this is just too much. Okay, I've selected sine wave here, level at 0 dB, so that you can see what happens here on the K meter. My fader's left at 0. Look at these values here. If I go to K14, do you see how the meter changed this range? If I go to K20, look how it extends. There. And if I go to 12, it changes again. So if I leave this on, this is really fiddly. K14, what I'm trying to achieve here is to get a value of 0 based on 14. So how do we do that? Well, we can either drag this down, or the sensible approach is to change the value here. If you watch that meter, to drag it to 0, have a guess what value I'm going to end up on. Oh look, minus 14. We have now calibrated this sine wave, or this channel, to the K standard of 14 or minus 14. This means we have minus 14 dB here. And to put that in actual terms, because remember our ceiling is here, we're talking about 14 dBs of headroom. End of story. That's literally it. If I was going for K12, you see where we've gone here, I would need to raise that level to 12 to hit 0. Because we're generating a sine wave, we're getting a peak and an RMS value at 0. You can either put the master plug in there, or, as I prefer, on every single channel. So how would I do it? Let's bring that back to 0. So we're peaking again. Forget the meter. In fact, let me switch that on so you can actually see it here as well. I'm going above because I've put it back on 0. But what do I like to use? I like to use Klanghelm. And the VUMT is my favorite meter at the moment. You can't get a more beautiful and simpler meter than this. Set your standard here. And mix your trim to get your 0. And have a guess what values we're going to end up with. Yes, you guessed it. Minus 14. Why? Because I'm in K14. I've now calibrated my VU to 0. What about PPM? Well, let's do that as well. We want to calibrate that so that it reads 0 at minus 14. I am seeing 0 both on the VU and the PPM, and I've got a trim knob built into this meter. What is the beauty of this meter is that not only do I have extensive settings on the way it behaves, but I have a trim knob. You might think that's something small, but it's actually our savior here. Do we need this on the master bus? Well, let's read it against the K plug. Perfect. bang on with the case. So we've now calibrated. We know that our channel stage is reading exactly the value we want against our master bus. Right, let's look at other problems. Let's disengage the sign. We don't need this anymore. And in fact, we can get rid of it. I don't see the result in it other than as a demo. So, okay, that's done now. Actually, should we just, yeah, let's just get rid of it. Now you can reference to this and literally forget that, or as I do, I love VU meters, so I like to have them on each and every channel. What I'm going to do is play a little bit of audio for you, and it's only the drum beats here. I'm sorry I'm dragging on here, but I'm trying to be very thorough. I've made only the drums visible in this mix. Otherwise, we'll be here all day doing loops, bass, lead, vocals, effects, blah, 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 blah. I've also made them visible here. Regarding color coding, I'll explain that in another video, and it's quite important how you color code because I like to match that to a spectrograph. How do I calibrate now on each and every channel? In Cubase, it's easy, but I'm going to assume we don't have a pre or a trim knob or a gain knob of any sort on the channel. Stick in the VUMT solo on mono channels and the stereo on stereo channels. I've already done that for you here. I've stuck them on all the drum channels. What I'm going to do now is solo each and every channel, play it, and calibrate. -14. I'd already done my little mix earlier, but I'll just pretend I haven't done it. Another good thing that I really do like about the VUMT is the display I have. Everything is in front of me. You set the standard here. I've set it against the PPM as well. And now you can see the difference between the two. Our average values are changing by 3 dBs. So the RMS against the peak is around 3 dBs. Let's go to the next one. Solo that. You can see I did quite a hefty attenuation here. Same thing. The reason I'm attenuating so much is because the idea is that once I set the levels for each and every one, I keep my eye on this. I don't want anything peaking above 0 because our 0 is -14. When you hit 0 here, you're actually hitting -14 dB of headroom or 14 dB of headroom. Let's bring in the next one. You'll appreciate that I've already done most of my VU and PPM stuff on these. I'm looking at the kick here. Now, because I'm working in EDM, I know this kick is quite important. I've given it a bit of welly. I can bring that down later in the mix or just leave it there. Right now, all I care about is my master bus not peaking. So I'm going to switch them all on and show you the master plug. Look at my average reading there, my RMS reading. It's floating around -5, -6 dB. Look at my peak. Even though it's around 4 or 5 dB above 0, that still leaves me a ton of headroom. I've got all this space and all this. Okay, we've got this far now. Have we done it right? Well, not really. Why not? Because the one thing no one's taken into account, especially the guy here, is that at some point you're going to need to bandpass clean. What does that mean? Well, let me show you. The reason I haven't done this here is because it's part of another tutorial. But let's just say that we need to do it. And for me to explain to you what it is. I always move my meters right to the end of the chain, because there's no point having it at the start of the chain. You want to read your values going out to your master bus after all your inserts. So what is the first thing I do here? Well, I bandpass clean everything. And if you're wondering what that is, that's to make sure we have clean signals everywhere and we get rid of redundant frequencies. And the reason this is important is because once you do this on every channel, you'll find that your values will start to change. You might be wondering, why is Ed doing this? Very simple. You'll find a lot of low energy sounds like drums, predominantly kicks, 808s, even 909s and such, will have a lot of subharmonic energy. You tend to find that low energy is wideband and the amplitudes can be really high, and you'll get errant transients that can trip compressors and things. So it's best to cut out anything you don't need and then calibrate afterwards. Because I've already done this, I'm just running through this for your benefit. I've disengaged them because I've got them going in another mix. I always switch my cycle snap mode off. I've covered bandpass cleaning in one of my other tutorials and how to match the slopes, but right now I'm just jumping through this for your benefit because I don't want to keep Klaus tied up all day long with this video. I'll teach you a little trick I tend to do on these ones. I wouldn't normally use the channel EQ to tidy this one up. I don't like the slopes on this. Normally I would use something like the TDK, the Nova. Fabian makes wonderful plugins. I'll disable everything. Don't need precision mode for this, just a high pass. Put the low pass in as well, we don't need a lot of that. But what's important here is the slope. The reason I don't like this is because I want extensive slopes, and when I'm dealing with kicks, I'll even go as high as 96 or 72. It's literally a brick wall cut. You could also, with kicks, make them quite funky, to be honest. With Fabian's plugin, it's just gorgeous. So now we got motion on the kick. Once I switch on my master bus, everything's starting to sound livelier and bigger. And imagine once I have compressors and God knows what else on this channel. I just thought I'd bring up Fabian's Nova Gentleman's Edition EQ because I really think everyone should have this. And I wish we had something like this nailed on every single channel in every door. It's not just about getting this dynamic EQ going on the kick. I'll switch it off for your benefit. It's more really about the slopes and how well this performs. I keep the life in there, whereas with these EQs it's just not quite the same. So once we go through all of that, we check everything against the final K meter, and I've got acres and acres and acres here. And even when I switch everything on, look at this. Remember, I'm mixing in RMS. Look how much headroom I've got. Acres. Bear in mind that once we start adding loops, basses, leads, etc., that's all going to have to change. So look at all my faders now. These faders now act as fine tube faders, which is exactly what we want. You'll find that in Logic, Logic again, you need to go into display, I think it's meter mode, and flip from logarithmic or exponential into linear mode. The problem you have with Logic is that all the fader information seems to be condensed right at the bottom. We want to extend that range. To end this video, what I'd like to say is really a little bit of advice to all DAW manufacturers. I'm going to very quickly show how we can do all of this without having to use any of these. I'll leave the EQ in there. I'll switch these off. And the way I do this is to use the control room in Cubase. Digital full scale. I can select my K14 from here. So now everything will read everything. Let's bring this back so we're playing more of the loop. It's playing through this now. Everything. So this is giving us all our peak values and our RMS values. Now remember, none of this has been calibrated because I've switched off all our pre's. So I'm going to do this within Cubase. And this is where Cubase starts to come into its own. Let me switch these. What do we need? Let's tidy up. Let's just keep the pre's on. You can see my EQ cuts for each channel. So these are now my gain knobs. What's Cubase doing? Following the channel strip concept. Now that I'm calibrating here using the meters, I'm looking at this. And my calibration takes place from here. If I go to the next channel, see it's peaking here again. I'll cut from here. Without even listening, I'll go and cut everything, and then we'll drop out of solo mode and listen to everything. This is purely guesswork, but it should be good fun. Once we've done this, we ask ourselves the main question: do we really need that master output? No, we don't. I don't need to see it. Not if I'm calibrating to the standard. I'll need it later because I'll need to stick on all my master bus dynamics. So let me drop that off and let's have a look at the calibration. And this is pure guesswork without listening to any channels. Wonderful. We got acres here. Acres and acres. On peak mode alone, we got 6 dB of headroom. 14 on RMS spread across all the channels. We could carry on mixing and mixing and mixing, and we'd never eat into that so long as we calibrated and brought our gains down. That's pretty much it. I can't think of anything else that would help you in terms of the K standard without delving into all the other videos. Right, I hope that helps. Thanks very much, guys, and enjoy yourselves.